It's my pleasure to introduce Michael, and after such a wonderful interlude, it's time to drill down further into linking the policy and practice divide. And it is my pleasure to introduce Professor of Education, Arts and Creativity, Michael Anderson, who is an internationally recognised educational leader. He's written countless books and has researched extensively in education and transformation over 20 years. And Michael has a particular passion for this thing called the 4 Cs. And they are collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking, and how they can be integrated using coherent frameworks to make learning meet the needs of 21st century learners. So Michael, I'm going to hand over to you, and please remember to put your questions in chat as you go. We want you to participate. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Virginia. Pretty hard act to follow, Talia. I've just felt like kind of floating away on a cloud there. Such beautiful music. And then I get the chance to talk about policy and practice, which feels a bit like a hard gig. But anyway, I'll try and make it as interesting, provocative and engaging as possible. Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to any elders present, past, present or emerging. So I think Robin has set up the challenge beautifully, which is to say, okay, we have a system that we know is not working as it should be, and yet we know for the good of our students that we can't just say, well, you know, we might as well just give up. We need, I think, to be working to ensure at a policy level, at a school level, at a classroom level, that transformation is possible and happening all the time. And I want to acknowledge before I begin that many of you will be nodding your head as you were in Robin's presentation and saying, yes, but we're already doing this. But I want to say, what more can we do? How much further can we push? How much more can we make education systems, whether they're in a Steiner school in the Northern Territory or a public school in, you know, Moree, or in a private school in Melbourne somewhere? How much more can we think about bringing what we want, what we need to the centre of education? What I want to talk about today is how we think about that. I want to define and understand this divide. I want to discuss the why for transformation. Like, why do we actually need to transform? What does transform actually mean? I want to explore the challenge of sustainable transformation. And I want to examine an emerging model that uses the 4 Cs to make transformation possible. This is a model we've been using in 50 schools throughout Australia in long-term partnerships to talk about the how of transformation, not just the kind of policy level kind of consideration. What does it actually mean in a classroom? So let's talk about, I mean, I know we all probably have a shared view about the why for transformation, but let's try and kind of bound it. And I like to use this concept called infinite and finite games. It's a concept that was kind of pioneered by a theologian called James P. Carse, C-A-R-S-E, in the 80s. And he talked about in society, in community, we have 2 kinds of games. He's using, obviously, games as a metaphor. We have finite games, and finite games are easy to understand. They're the games that we're all involved in all the time. Games like soccer, tennis. You know when someone's won and lost tennis. You know what the rules are generally, and everyone abides by those rules. And the idea is someone wins, and therefore someone loses. And then we've got the idea of infinite games. These are the games that go on forever. And the idea is not to have winners and losers. The idea is to have participants, people who are constantly in the game. The idea is to continually invoke participation, to find excellence for everyone at whatever level that might be. And so that means that everyone's education is as important as everyone else's, because we're trying to keep everyone engaged and continuing in the game. And of course, in terms of finite games, we see them all the time in education. NAPLAN, HSC, where there are winners and losers constantly. Assessment practices that make winners and losers, and ranking across the board. Now, on one level, there are roles for finite games. For instance, if we had a testing regime that actually helped students learn and gave positive feedback for teachers about how to build capacities and capabilities across the board, and that went to teachers and students and was for them to build learning, that might be a useful finite game. And yet we have a finite game in NAPLAN which looks at very narrow capabilities, albeit important capabilities, critical capabilities, but then uses that as a way to rank this school against a school down the road. And of course, that leads to all sorts of difficult changes in a system that aren't meant to be there. Whereas if we're thinking about infinite games, that all changes. We actually change our priorities to keep everybody participating all the time. So what is the divide? What does the gap look and feel like? Robin's already touched on this, so I'm not going to go into much depth here, but the gap looks and feels like this, I think. And I'm using Public Image Limited, Johnny Rotten, and that band from the 70s. A certain generation of people will remember them. They had a very famous song called "This Is What We Want, This Is What We Get," and that's the way I've started to think about what this gap looks like. What we want is deep learning, transdisciplinary learning, student and teacher agency, holistic learning, experience-based learning, arts-based learning, embodied learning, 4Cs learning. I think when I say we, this is what we want in terms of the schools we work with. And I imagine many of those things are the things that you would like as well for your students. However, what we get is standardized testing, accountability regimes, teach to the test pedagogies, disconnected curriculum, disconnected from students' worlds, disconnected from the world around us, and a schooling system that lacks an explicit grounding in the 4Cs: creativity, critical reflection, collaboration, and communication. So that's kind of already known. And we call this in Transforming Schools, which is a book that I co-authored with Miranda Jefferson in 2017, the pedagogy policy gap. The things that we notice back here, the things that we want, aren't actually antithetical in terms of policy. You read policy right back to the Melbourne Declaration, and these kinds of learning experiences are either implicit or explicit. And yet, when we get to learning systems, when we look at what is coming out of NASA, what's coming out of the Department of Education, we get this kind of tension, this double bind, where schools are being forced in one direction, but at a policy level being told to work in another direction. So the problem is well known and well established, but what do we actually do about escaping this double bind? How do we actually untie this Gordian knot? How do we move to a place where we are able to kind of bridge this policy practice divide? So what we've come up with in our work with our schools is the idea of sustainable transformation that has several pieces. You'll notice that the 4Cs are at the center of that: creativity, collaboration, communication, critical reflection. They hold all of these things together. But if we're thinking about transforming a school, wherever that might be, we think that these are the key facets of making that a possibility. We have to think about curriculum in a way that is connected to students and their learning and their context, not just curriculum as is handed down from a bureaucracy. We have to think about teacher education as a continuum that starts in foundational teacher education at the kinds of places that Robin and I work, University of Sydney. We have to think about how we make that about experience, inquiry and reflection, and how we use those foundations to change teacher education in schools. So it's not about some guru turning up and then dispensing kind of quote unquote wisdom for a day and then everybody else going off and doing what they've already done. But it's about giving teachers the agency to inquire into their own classrooms, to respond to their own experience and reflect on it. How do we embed that into the profession so that it's an expectation rather than an exception? We've got to support leadership to be collaborative, communicative, creative and critically reflective in everything they do. We've got to make pedagogy effective and broad-ranging, so those kind of aspirations for holistic learning and those aspirations for embodied learning are a possibility. And we've got to think about learning as a joined up system rather than a disparate system. And finally, the values that we use to kind of push our school into transformation need to be changed. And so bringing all those pieces together is really what we're thinking about. Here's a not too subtle kind of product placement. These are the 3 books we've written to try and get under the bonnet of how transformation can happen, the how of transformation. Transforming schools in 2017, transforming organisations that looks at how we apply the learning that we know can work in schools to organisations generally. And then our new book, which is coming out in April next year, called Transforming Education, which drills down deeply into curriculum, into values, into pedagogy, into leadership, to try and understand the kinds of things that we can do to make a difference. So, having said all that, how is sustainable transformation made possible? If we were starting out today to think about how we move from where we are to make transformation possible school by school, what might that look like? And I want to say from the outset, I actually think that having chased after policy change in the way that Robin has, together Robin and I have been working at this for many, many years, it seems to me like policy change at a state and even federal level is only going to happen when it starts to percolate up from parents and students and schools. So what I'm talking about here is very much a school by school process. And that's why we have a commitment in our organisation to actually work with schools, each school individually and contextually, rather than just kind of doing a one size fits all. In fact, rollouts across systems rarely work. They are rarely effective because they get diluted and decontextualized. But what might this look like? So what do we need? I think we need coherent frameworks. I think we need a contextual focus. I think we need networks to support each other, and certainly the Steiner network is an outstanding example of that. And finally, I think we need persistence. And I'm going to speak really quickly to some of those things and what they might look like. One of the issues that we have in education policy is we have these concepts that I call aerosol concepts. And they are things like creativity, communication, collaboration. They're sprayed around all the time in policy documents by people talking like myself, but rarely do we ever have the opportunity to make them teachable or tangible. So they're sprayed around, they smell fantastic, but when we try and grab them, they're gone. Now, the problem with that is if we can't have a working conceptualization of what makes these concepts coherent, we are unlikely to be able to teach them. And so what we outline in Transforming Schools is Coherence Makers, which are really frameworks or scaffolds for learning that that actually define pedagogically what we see as the critical ways of understanding things like creativity are. Now, notwithstanding there are other models and other ways of doing things, these are the ways that we think can work across the curriculum and across the learning stages. And they're coherent frameworks in many places. So we've got one that talks about learning. I'll look at that in a moment. It's called the Learning Disposition Wheel. One for pedagogy, one for leadership, and of course, one for each of the 4 Cs. So the Learning Disposition Wheel. One of the reasons that we need coherent frameworks for learning is so that we can speak to each other with one way of understanding learning, with a common voice, with a common vocabulary. What you can see there is one of our schools who have actually taken the Learning Disposition Wheel and made it into a desk where they actually work with parents and students and teachers to talk about how a student is going, and they produce work samples that they actually place in different parts of the Learning Disposition Wheel. You can also see on the left-hand side, it's a public school in New South Wales, Sydney's southern suburbs, where the Learning Disposition Wheel is being used actively as a way for students to reflect on their own learning. So what is it? And why does it matter? It matters, I think, because it gives us a way to talk about the kinds of dispositions that are going to be critical for our learners, not only from early childhood, but right through to university. This comes from research by the National Academy in the US, who did a meta-analysis of what they called transferable 21st century learning. I think the term 21st century learning is problematic. Like many people in education, I think it's problematic because I think these are actually 20th century and 14th century and probably 22nd century dispositions. But what you can see is we've broken learning into 3 areas: the intrapersonal, the interpersonal, and the cognitive. And it's in the shape of a wheel so that all of these support each other. And so learning isn't just cognitive, it's not just intrapersonal, it's interpersonal. All of these areas depend on one another to make learning possible. And so when students are learning about mathematics or music or drama or English or geography, they're not only learning the content of whatever it is they're learning, they're actually learning how to develop these dispositions to make them successful learners in whatever they're doing. And I think this aligns very much with the kinds of approaches that I've seen Steiner taking to education, educating the whole child rather than just kind of education that thinks about the cognitive and forgets about the interpersonal and the intrapersonal. So for instance, I was at a school very successful by kind of, I suppose, traditional standards, very academically successful school, you might say, in terms of the HSC. And the principal there said to me, oh, look, that's great. We do a lot of the blue, but we don't really do the orange or the green. And I suppose my response to that, well, my response actually was, well, if you're not doing the orange or the green, you're not really doing the blue, because all of these facets, all of these skills, all of these dispositions support each other. So of course, grit is really important when you're trying to make and express meaning or build new ideas, which is creativity. Curiosity is critical to developing learning right through from kindergarten, right through to old age. So how you develop those dispositions, how you generate them is critical, and yet we rarely in many schools talk about these dispositions, let alone teaching them or working towards developing them strongly. These are the coherence makers for the 4 Cs. I won't go through them in detail, but suffice to say, they are a way of understanding and digging deeper into the 4 Cs. And by digging deeper, I mean, how do we connect learning up? How do we make interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary learning work? Well, one of the ways is understanding how the 4 C's connect, how creativity connects music and mathematics, or history and science, how collaboration connects those things as well. And yet, do we spend enough to, I suppose our question is, do we spend sufficient time talking about how collaboration models work? In our minds, we don't. We don't actually spend enough time talking about these underlying constructs, underlying capacities, which are absolutely crucial and critical to learning. So, and then there's this idea of contextual focus, that every school is different, so every transformation journey must be different. A journey in a Steiner school, so partnership with a Steiner school for transformation is completely different to a public school in New South Wales' south coast, or in a Northern Territory school, or in an early childhood setting. And I think what we've done in education for far too long is just focus on kind of the thing rather than the context and the thing. If we want transformation to be successful, we must understand how the context is going to interact with the transformation process. And that's why we work in partnerships in this way. And it's across all demographics that we work. We work in distance education, hospital schools. We work in private schools, public schools. In our 50 partnership schools, you will see a real variety, because what we're interested in is not necessarily the sector or the politics of the sector, but how we build networks amongst all of our schools, primary, high schools, the lot, to create context that makes a difference for transformation. And then that network that I was talking about before, and what you can see in a couple of these pictures, is not people slavishly taking the ideas that we've come up with, but actually applying them and contextualizing them to their own setting. And this picture on the right here, what you'll notice is that these are 2 early stage 1 kids from Tarmore Public School. Those kids are actually part of the professional learning. They are supporting the professional learning, because if we don't hear student voice in our professional learning, it's going to be very difficult for us as teachers to understand student perspective. And so all of our professional learning networks always have students embedded in the learning and as part of the learning. So what you can see there is a process that I think differentiates us from networks that look at kind of a one-size-fits-all. And then persistence. School transformation takes more than a week, it takes more than a month, it takes more than a year. In fact, some of the schools that we've been partnering with, we've been working with for 4 or 5 years. And it's slow and there are setbacks, but there are also incredible joys when you can start to understand pedagogy, when you can start to understand curriculum, when you can start to understand leadership as a joined up process for change. And when it comes down to it, and this is my last kind of slide, I think Di Smith's quote is critical. Di Smith remade the Welsh education system around creativity and the arts. And his kind of position is, I think, really inspirational for us as we think about how we're going to change. If we ask who then should benefit from the wealth of possibilities education could bring, the answer is a trumpet call. The dispossessed and the marginalised, for whom it is an exit from powerlessness and an entrance to the interchange of citizenship. For me, transformation is possible. It is possible when we bring together the best of education, when we fight for what we want rather than what we've got, when we look to how schools can change deeply what happens not only in their school but in their society. And having done that, we can actually engage with these big kind of questions of poverty and powerlessness that Robin mentioned, and actually make a definite change, not only for our students, but for the students that will come. And for me, this isn't an option. It's not an option for us to sit back and say it's all too hard. We actually, it is our duty, I think, as educators to fight for the education system we know is possible. And that's a school by school proposition. Thanks very much.
I took myself off mute. That was good. And Michael, thank you so much. That was a very powerful conclusion to a really absorbing presentation. And look, please put your questions in the chat. We probably don't have that much time for questions, but we certainly will for a couple. And one I want to ask as a provocation to all, and including, you know, Steiner schools who happen to be on this Zoom, you asked right at the beginning, how much more can we do, just say, for people who seem to be already doing, you know, a lot of this activity, but we need to do more. And you said, how much more can we do to bring the transformation to the centre of education rather than on the periphery? And what do you think, Michael? What more can be done? I know you're saying it's a school by school transformation. I really understand that. And just as a collective though, what more can be done, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it comes down to a few things. I think it comes down to coherence. Often what we find when we start working with schools is that they are doing so much, like they are doing incredible amounts of work, and they actually have to stop doing some things because there's it's not so much a cult of busyness, but there are kind of, there's a lot of busy work in schools that isn't actually about student-centered activity. There's a lot of, I think it comes back to me asking, parent-teacher nights are the classic. When we ask the question, why do we do parent-teacher nights? The answer, and I'm sure Steiner schools probably don't do them in the way that a lot of the schools we work with do, but the answer usually comes back, well, we've always done them. To me, that's not a good enough response. And really, why would we do that when it's not particularly effective? No one seems to like it much, and it's not particularly productive for students at all. So how actually can we reimagine and rethink that? I mean, Robin used reimagining in her talk, and we talk about in our new book, in the title of our new book, reimagining pedagogy, reimagining curriculum, etc., because it's really important that we start to drill down, I think, into those taken for granted concepts and reimagine them. And I think Steiner is doing a lot in that space, but my challenge to anyone who's here today is, I reckon if we came and worked with you and reflected with you, we can show you how to do much more, much better. Because actually, that's not because we're particularly special. It's because any time that you get the chance to reflect deeply about the things that you've taken for granted, you'll start to identify things that have just become part of the furniture. Yeah. And I think making your school coherent and making every part of the curriculum, assessment and pedagogy kind of triangle work to support each other that's how I think we make the change. And this isn't only a Steiner response, I think we start working in schools across the board, so no one can point at a certain sector and say, oh, well, that's okay for Steiner, but it's not okay for kids in an autism spectrum school or something like that. We actually make it work across the board, so it's kind of resistant to that kind of suggestion, I think.
That's a fabulous answer, response, Michael. And that coherence, you know, all people are challenged with that coherence of assessment, pedagogy, and curriculum. And I'd like to add leadership. I was particularly interested in you including that in the coherence factor as you take something like collaboration. and people think they know what that means. And it takes a lot of skill, and it takes a lot of skill in leadership to lead collaboratively and to develop collaborative pedagogy, etc. It's a big thing to cohere all those things together in particular contexts.
Yeah, and I imagine a lot of leaders with us today will have been thrown into leadership without any kind of support. Well, maybe not in Steiner, but I know that a lot of the leaders we work with got just kind of thrown in. And what we've actually developed, based on self-determination theory, a coherence maker for leadership. And that actually is a fantastic way for leadership teams to start to talk about where their strengths and weaknesses are, where their yet to be strengths are. So, yeah, that's kind of really critical, I think.
Absolutely. So Elspeth has, just quickly, I'll just read out a couple of comments. Transforming from where to where. I think that's rather an interesting question. And do we know our starting point well enough, and where are our blind spots? So
that's a great question, Elspeth. Yeah. So it's always transforming from where you are to where you need to be. And that sounds really glib, but when we go in and work with schools, we actually sit down and problem find. You know, one of the things that gets very wearisome in education is I think we find ourselves burdened by the enormity of the task of transformation. But actually, when you sit down and you work out that actually schools have got amazing resources, the human resources in schools are unparalleled almost anywhere in our community. And when you sit down, you look at them and you look at what you can do and what you need to do, it becomes really, I think, reasonably clear where you are and where you need to get to. I mean, that's a process of reflection that takes a while, but it's a process of reflection that in our schools actually puts them on a path and gives them a real clarity and gives their leadership clarity as well. So, yeah, that'd be my response.
Thank you, Michael. And Michael, do you dare answer this one? What would you see? What would you see, or what suggestions would you give to Steiner schools? Or what do you see as the weaknesses, or what, well, actually Lynn asked, what would you see as the weaknesses of Steiner schools in this regard? Go on. Answer.
Encouraging me to self-immolate.
No.
Look, I want to say that at the outset, I want to acknowledge that Steiner is ahead of so many other educational networks, frameworks, etc., etc. But I wonder whether that is getting to as many children as possible, and if there was a clearer offer from some Steiner education schools, whether that would be more attractive to more people. I mean, I don't think the problem is necessarily what's going on in Steiner schools. I think that there's extraordinary work going on, but actually, as a parent, what Steiner offers, I think, is still rather opaque. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I think all of the learning that goes on, if you can make it coherent within a structure, whether it be the structure that we're talking about or any other structure, which has an evidence base, and I don't mean evidence in the kind of narrow terms, an evidence base behind it, you can make a very strong argument, I think, to parents and the community about what is distinctive. And I think this is a very big opportunity for Steiner in the next decade, actually, that there is something distinctive. It is something that fits very much with what our community needs and demands in terms of the way the world is changing. But it's making a connection between that and how we actually communicate that to the community at large. And I think that is still a bit of a challenge.
Still a work in progress. Michael, thank you so much for that. That's really insightful. So thank you. So I think we're just going to have to finish up here. There was Tracy who said, I think the work of transformation is to be continually working towards your school's vision and making sure all your decisions are supporting the ability to achieve it. And I agree with Michael that Steiner schools need to be more accessible to families and need to get out the message out there in language that everyone understands. So there's somebody who definitely supported what you were saying, Michael. And there's another comment. I wanted to know which setbacks that your team faced in that transformation project that provided the most reflection, catalyst, change in your framework. So I think we might leave that there. And so thank you so much, Michael. That was, really
Pleasure, Virginia. Thanks for having me.